My name is Brian Dougherty. I'm a field ag engineer with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and today we want to talk a little bit about some of the advantages and some of the challenges of applying manure in dry field conditions. So today we're here at Stutzman's Incorporated near Hills, Iowa. So I'd like to thank them for allowing us to use their facility here. So when it comes to applying manure, there are definitely some advantages to having dry field conditions. The first one being that you don't have to worry about the mud as much. There's less compaction generally when you're applying in dry conditions. And the second is that, with dry soil, it actually has more capacity to hold liquid manure. So it's a little bit easier to get that manure infiltrated and get it held in the soil when you have dry soil conditions. There's just more capacity in the soil because those pores aren't filled up with water. And then the third one this year, with our dry conditions in some parts of the state, a lot of that crop might come out earlier than normal. And so that gives us more time this fall potentially to get field work done. So that can be, especially after the last few years of challenging field conditions in the fall, that might be a welcome break for producers to have that extra time to get some field work done. But, there are some concerns as well with dry conditions. One being when the soil's dry, it tends to be a little bit harder. And so there might be some challenges in getting the injectors into the soil, getting that manure injected with the hard soil. The second one is soil cracking. So if you're in a very dry area and you're seeing those cracks show up in your soil, there is potential for what we would call macropore flow in that case. So if you're injecting through that or you're applying manure, it can actually run down those cracks and end up deeper in the soil profile than we would like. Ideally, we want that manure up closer to the surface. We want it covered, but we want it close to the surface. So next spring when the crop starts growing, those nutrients are up fairly close to the root zone. So when you have cracks in the soil, that manure can end up deeper in the profile. Here in Iowa, it's typically hasn't been a big concern. Our cracks generally go about 20 inches or so deep. You usually don't see them much deeper than that. In other parts of the Midwest here, you get around the Great Lakes area, there are more concerns. They have more shrink swell clay soils, so they will expand and contract as moisture changes, and they can get some very deep cracks. And there's potential for those to go almost all the way down to the tile line. So it's something to keep in mind. We want to be aware of that if you do have a lot of cracking, there's potential for that macropore flow. But if you're concerned about it, you could take a rod and just kind of probe those cracks and see how deep they go. But it's something to be aware of here. And then the last one I would mention is, we do have potentially better conditions for getting in the field this fall. But that might also lead to a situation where you want to get out there and get everything done while the weather's nice. But if you're applying that manure before the soil has cooled below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, there's definitely some concerns there with potentially losing some of those nutrients. And that kind of ties in with the dry weather. Another issue that we could have is more nitrogen left in the soil profile. If you've taken less yield off the field, you've had dry conditions, that tends to slow down microbial activity in the soil. And so we can end up with a situation where there's more nitrate or available nitrogen left in the soil profile after fall harvest than what we would normally have. And then if you're applying additional manure on top of that, there's potential to lose a lot of those nutrients before the spring crop goes in. And we did see that in 2012. Where we had a very dry year that year, and so there was not very much water flowing through the tile lines. Yields were down. We had a fair amount of nitrogen left in the soil profile in the fall, and then in the spring of 2013, we had a lot of precipitation, and a lot of that nitrogen got flushed out of the system before it was taken up with the crop. So there's advantages to dry conditions. There's also some things that we need to be aware of. So right now we are seeing a fair amount of precipitation over a lot of the state. So we may actually end up with some areas that are wetter than we would like with fall manure application. So in that case, you're definitely going to be concerned about compaction. You want to just try and wait for a good stretch of weather Again, wait until those soils have cooled down before you go out and try to apply that manure. If that soil is kind of right at field capacity where it's holding as much water as it can, that's where we tend to see the most compaction. So those are the kind of conditions that we want to avoid if possible. And again, when that soil is filled up with water and all of that pore space is filled, that doesn't leave a lot of room if you're injecting liquid manure. You know, that manure has to have somewhere to go. It has to have some pore space to hold that manure. And so if it's very wet, that can definitely create some challenges. As far as recommendations or best practices for manure application this year, the first thing I would mention is just having good equipment maintenance, making sure that everything's working properly on your manure application equipment. So you want to make sure that if you've got sweeps or coulters or whatever you have on your application equipment, you want to make sure those are nice and sharp. Again, if you've got dry soil conditions, you want to make sure you can slice through that hard soil, so that's important. And a few years back, the ag engineers did some research looking at manure application equipment, and they found that there was a lot of variation in application rate across the toolbar. And there's different things that can cause that. One of the issues they found were the air vents were getting plugged on some of the tankers. So if you can see up at the top of the unit here, there's some little circular vents up there, and so they allow the pump to work properly. But what can happen, you know, as you're turning your pump on and off, a little bit of manure can get up into those vents. As long as you keep applying, that's not a problem. But when you go to put that equipment away for the season, if those vents aren't cleaned out, that manure can sit in there and actually plug that air vent. And so if that happens, that tends to cause a lot of uneven manure application across the toolbar. So for example, if you're targeting a 200-pound nitrogen application rate, you might have 300 pounds coming out out of one tube and maybe 100 pounds in a different one. So there can be a lot of variation there. So what we recommend is definitely check over your equipment before you start applying. It's a good idea to just put several hundred gallons of water in the tank, just turn your pump on and come around behind and just look across your application toolbar and see if it looks like there's relatively even distribution or roughly the same amount coming out of each tube. The other thing that can happen is these tubes, you want to make sure those aren't crimped. If you can get rid of the loops in those hoses, that can also help. So keep them as short as possible and try to eliminate those hose loops. So check your loops, make sure they're not kinked, check your air vents, and then just do a, you know, kind of a pre-season check and make sure that that toolbar is applying the way it should be. The next recommendation that I would have, you know, once you've got your equipment maintenance up to snuff, is just looking at the timing. So we want to delay those manure applications until that soil has cooled below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So the 50-degree range is, research has found that's when the microbial activity in the soil really starts to slow down. So if you're above 50 degrees, the microbial activity, those microbes are still fairly active, and it's those microbes that drive the nitrogen cycle in the soil. So they're the microbes are converting that ammonium to nitrate, and nitrate is very soluble, and it easily moves basically wherever the water goes in the soil, that's where your nitrate's going to go. So we want to wait until those soils have cooled down below 50 degrees, if at all possible, before we apply, you know, whether it's manure or any other nitrogen source, just to help prevent, you know, we don't want that cycling happening. So if we wait till later in the fall, hopefully that nitrogen will still be there in the spring. Another management practice that you can do along with that is consider the use of a nitrification inhibitor. So what that does is it just prevents those microbes from converting that nitrogen from ammonium to nitrate. And so that can help potentially reduce some of those nitrogen losses. The yield data on the inhibitors is kind of mixed. We've got some research from Nashua showing that we are seeing a yield advantage with the Instinct nitrification inhibitor. If it was put in with fall manure, We had one year where it went on with spring manure and we saw no advantage in that case. On the water quality side, we haven't really seen any benefits with the nitrification inhibitors, but there's some research that shows that you can get a pretty good yield response with that. Other research is more mixed. You know, the yields aren't statistically different, and you know, sometimes it doesn't cover the cost of the inhibitor. So I can't give a blanket recommendation that everybody should use that, but it's another tool that you can look at to help keep some of that nitrogen in the fall. And then the final recommendation I would have is to plant a cover crop if at all possible. Having that cover crop there can help with some of these issues where you've got extra nitrogen in the fall. You can, if you plant, you know, grass cover crops or brassicas, they're very good at taking that nitrogen up out of the soil profile and holding it in the biomass. And then the following spring, that biomass will degrade when you terminate it, and at least some portion of that should become available for the crop the following year. So if you have dry manure that you're applying, that's a little bit different situation than liquid manure. The nitrogen in dry manure tends to be more in the organic form, so it's less likely to be lost. So I would say if you have both, if you have dry manure and liquid manure to apply, you would want to apply your dry manure first and then wait on the liquid manure until, you know, the soils have cooled down below 50 degrees if at all possible. You know, when it comes to applying dry manure, that's generally going to go on the surface and then be incorporated with some sort of tillage equipment. So as far as the, you know, difference between liquid and dry manure in that respect, you really shouldn't have many issues with the dry manure as long as your tillage equipment is set up properly. There are resources available to help producers. There's several commercial labs here in the state and around the Midwest that will do manure analysis. So I'd recommend taking a sample and submitting that to a lab. If you're looking for labs to submit to, you can go to the Iowa Manure Management Action Group website. If you just do a web search for, again, Iowa Manure Management Action Group, you can find a list of labs that are certified for doing manure analysis. And also, if you're looking for assistance with manure management plans, there's a list of service providers on that website as well that can help you with manure management plans. And if you're having trouble finding somebody, all of the extension field ag engineers can also assist with manure management plans. So there are several different styles of manure injectors and application equipment, and they will all have, you know, slightly different effects on the soil. So this particular injector here is a fairly low disturbance unit. So it's got a coulter that runs in front of the injector. Your manure comes out here, and then this will actually be below the soil, and then there's a blade behind that will basically close that trench back up again. So when you're applying this manure with an injector, the main goal is just to get it below the surface and get that closed back up. You don't want to see any liquid on the surface. Several advantages there. You know, a big one is odor control. So if you can keep that covered up, it really helps reduce odor. And then the other is it really helps to reduce nutrient loss, particularly from surface runoff, if you can get that manure injected. Okay, so here's another style of manure application equipment. Now from a distance, this might look like a manure injector, but this is actually what's considered surface application followed by incorporation. So the manure is just coming out the hose here. It's actually getting applied on the soil surface, and then the blades throw some soil up and cover that manure. And so that keeps it fairly close to the surface. But with this type of equipment, you do have quite a bit of soil disturbance because you have to be able to pull up enough soil to get that manure covered. So this would not be what we would consider, you know, minimum or low disturbance equipment. The other option for applying manure is if you're going to surface apply, you can actually have the manure come out what we call a splash plate up at the top here, and that basically just spreads it on the surface, and then you come back with some tillage equipment and incorporate that manure. Will it work better here or this, whichever one you can see? Okay, yeah. Okay. So here's another style of manure injector. This is what we call a sweep injector. So you can see here it's got this one has a pretty large sweep on it. So this is very similar to what you would find on a cultivator or, you know, a chisel plow, that sort of thing. So the manure is going below the surface. The sweep opens up a slot underneath the soil where to hold that manure, and then generally you'll get quite a bit of disturbance with this type of unit. So this is an older style. It has a very large sweep on it and it's angled, so it's basically going to look like that field has been chisel plowed when you get done. There's a variation on this style that's called a knife injector, where it's similar to this, but it just doesn't have the wide sweep on the bottom. That'll make more of a up and down slot in the soil for the manure. And the newer style injectors that have the sweeps are much lower disturbance. They tend to have a shovel here that's very flat, so it just slices through the soil. It doesn't lift it, and so it'll inject the manure into that slot. And so a lot of the application equipment now is going to more of that style where they're much lower disturbance. You know, we have a lot of people that are trying to transition to no-till or do minimum tillage. And so that's kind of the trend we're seeing in the industry, is the move towards more low disturbance injection equipment. So here we have a quick demonstration of different field application methods. So this is surface application. So ironically enough, we're here talking about application in dry conditions, but this was filmed up in Almaquee County and they had over 5 inches of rain in the week prior to shooting this video. So this is a field where the corn was chopped off for silage, so there's a fair amount of wheel compaction here. Again, very wet soils. So in these particular conditions, it can actually work better to go ahead and surface apply that liquid manure. It can be difficult to inject in these conditions, as you'll see in a minute, but this will be tilled in as soon as it's dry enough, and then a cereal rye cover crop will be planted into this to help hold on to some of those nutrients. So that's a good way to approach this corn silage ground. And you can see here what that looks like after that manure has been applied. So there's a fair amount of liquid on the surface, but that will dry relatively quickly. And again, this will be tilled in and planted to a cover crop. Here's just another image of what that looks like immediately after, and then this is taken 3 hours later. So you can see it dries relatively quickly. So now we'll shift gears to injection. So this is what I'd call a knife injector, so a fairly narrow sweep on the bottom there to open up that channel. So this will be somewhere in between a wide sweep, which would cause a lot of disturbance, and a coulter injector, which would be very low disturbance. But what this illustrates is the importance of both pre-season maintenance and field conditions when you're injecting. So these injectors hadn't been used for over a year. They just tried this out so we could film some video here. But you'll see some issues as the machine goes by here. The injectors are not getting the manure into the ground. There's not enough down pressure on this unit. There's some plugging issues, and you can see there's a gasket that's leaking there, so we've got some liquid still coming out the top. You can see, I slowed the video down here, you can see that unit bouncing. So again, not enough down pressure there. Very wet soil conditions, very hard, so it's difficult to inject manure in these types of conditions. So again, the soil conditions play a big role here. In this particular case, that soil is wet, so it's going to have a difficult time, even if you did get those injectors in properly, for that soil to be able to hold all of that liquid. And so in these particular conditions, you know, the surface application actually works better.